I am Sarah. I'm 38 years old, a registered nurse in Boise, Idaho. And I've always believed in family, maybe too much. For most of my adult life, I thought loyalty, sacrifice, and love would be enough to hold us together. That blood would always mean something, but I've come to realize even the people you love the most can betray you in ways you never imagined. It started quietly, almost like background noise in a hospital hallway, distant, vague, ignorable, until it's right in your ear and you can't unhear it. You can't unfeel it. My mother passed away 2 years ago, Alzheimer's, and for 5 long years before that, I was her full-time caregiver. The world doesn't really prepare you for what it's like watching someone you love slowly forget who you are, forget who they are. Every day, a little more of her slipped away, and I held on tighter, even when there was nothing left to hold on to. I was exhausted. I was grieving even before she was gone. But I never walked away. I stayed. I gave up promotions. I missed holidays. I changed her, fed her, bathed her, comforted her. I watched her stare out the window for hours at a time, whispering names from another lifetime. My hands were the last ones to hold hers when she died. And through all of that, my sister Natalie, she was gone. Not physically, no. She lived just 40 minutes away, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually gone. She had her own life, her own family, her own problems. I get it. People move on. People cope in their own ways. But she barely called, barely visited. And when she did, it was always rushed, always polite, always shallow. It hurt, but I told myself she was doing her best. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you, I still don't fully understand how she could do it. But she did. After our mother passed, the house was supposed to be ours, shared. That was our parents' wish. It's what they wrote down, what they told us for years. You girls will always have a place. Always. I held on to that. I needed that, not just for the value of the home, but because every corner of that house held memories of Mom, of Dad, of us, when we still felt like a family. I went back one day, 6 months after the funeral. I hadn't been there in a while. I had planned to clean out some of Mom's old things, maybe sit in her garden for a while. I brought a book, thought I'd stay the night, but when I got there, the front door was different. So was the lock. I stood on that porch for what felt like an eternity, heart-pounding, keys in hand, trying to understand why my key didn't work. And then the door opened. A stranger, a woman, maybe in her 50s, startled, confused. "Can I help you?" she asked. I thought maybe she was lost, or that she was looking for Natalie. "No, sorry, this is my mother's home," I told her gently with a smile that felt shaky. But what she said next, "Oh, I bought this place last month." My heart stopped. I remember blinking, staring at her, not understanding. "No, that's not possible. There must be a mistake. This home, it was passed down to me and my sister." She looked at me with genuine concern, but also with a strange kind of sympathy. She said, "I'm sorry, but the paperwork is finalized. I bought it from Natalie Prescott, fully notarized." I didn't hear anything after that. I couldn't. My ears were ringing. My vision blurred. My body went cold. I stumbled to my car and sat there for over an hour just staring at the dashboard, my mind spiraling. I called Natalie 5 times. No answer. She finally texted back 3 hours later. "We need to talk. I'll explain everything." But she never really did, because some things, they can't be explained. She sold our mother's house, she forged my signature, and she used the money, nearly $400,000, to bail out her husband's failing business. "A temporary solution," she said. "An emergency." She looked me in the eye days later, as I sat across from her in her sunlit kitchen, the same kitchen where I once braided her hair as kids, and told me she had no choice. No choice but to lie, to steal, to erase the one thing I had left of Mom. Her voice cracked as she tried to spin it, how she planned to pay me back, how desperate they were, how she thought I'd never find out how sorry she was. But sorry doesn't mean much when the ink on the forged deed is still fresh. I was numb for a while. Then I was angry. Then I was done. Natalie always thought I was the quiet one, the forgiving one, the nurse who carried everyone else's pain. But this time, I wasn't going to swallow it. I found the old lawyer who handled our family's estate, Mr. Carlson. He'd known us since we were kids. He remembered Mom's voice. He remembered how she cried when signing the documents. He believed me. He looked through everything. Every fake form, every falsified line, every manipulated signature. And when he looked up at me, his voice low, he said, "We can fight this. You have a case, Sarah, but it won't be easy. I didn't care. Because some battles are worth it, not for revenge, but for truth, for dignity, for justice, and for every single day I spent feeding Mom oatmeal with a spoon while Natalie pretended our family was too heavy to carry. I didn't want war, but I wasn't going to sit in silence while my sister turned our family legacy into a cash withdrawal. And the worst part, the part I couldn't say out loud until much later, it wasn't just the betrayal. It was that tiny voice in the back of my mind asking, was I ever worth anything to her at all? The lawsuit started. Slowly, documents, hearings, statements. Natalie lawyered up. Her husband stopped making eye contact with me at grocery stores. But I didn't back down. And eventually, we had the family meeting, the one she never wanted. I called everyone, aunts, uncles, cousins. I told them it was about Mom, about the house, about the truth. They came, they listened. And when I stood in that crowded living room with photos of Mom still smiling from the mantel, I didn't shout, I didn't accuse. I told the truth, and it was enough to break the silence, to crack the pretty picture Natalie had painted of her sacrifices, her struggles, her misunderstanding. She wept, she begged, she said it was a mistake. But the damage had been done, and somewhere deep in her tears, I think she knew it. I still don't know how to forgive her. Maybe I never fully will. But I knew one thing, I wasn't going to let her destroy the only part of Mom I had left, the past, and maybe, just maybe, the future. Because what I did with that money once the court ruled in my favor, that's another story. One worth telling, but not yet, not tonight, because something happened after the truth came out. Something none of us expected. Something that changed everything. And if you think this story ends with justice and peace, you don't know my family. After that family meeting, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I thought once the truth was out, once Natalie was forced to face what she had done, maybe, just maybe, we could start to heal. But healing, it's never as simple as just telling the truth. The days that followed were a quiet storm. Natalie disappeared for a while. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts went silent. She wasn't answering the endless calls from relatives. She wasn't showing up at family events or even at the grocery store where I used to see her occasionally. It was as if she was trying to disappear, to hide from the consequences from our family, from me. And yet every time I thought about her silence, my heart twisted with a strange mixture of anger and sorrow. Because deep down, I knew she was hurting too. Her husband's business was still failing. They had no savings left. The trust we once had was shattered, and maybe, just maybe, she was drowning in guilt. One evening, about 2 weeks after the court ruling, I was sitting alone in the living room nursing a cup of tea when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Natalie. I stared at the screen for minutes before opening it. "Sarah, can we meet, please? I want to try." I swallowed hard. "Try," I whispered to myself. Try to fix what she broke, try to make amends, or try to justify the unjustifiable. The next day, we met at a small cafe, not our usual spot, but neutral ground. Quiet, dimly lit, perfect for difficult conversations. She looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in weariness. Her eyes, once bright and confident, were now heavy with regret and exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she said before I could speak. I nodded slowly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I never did. But I want to explain. To be honest," I told her to go on. She took a deep breath. "The business was failing faster than I realized. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way to fix things before anyone got hurt, but it spiraled. I was desperate. And then I panicked." She looked down at her hands, twisting the napkin nervously. "I know I betrayed you. I betrayed Mom's memory, and I hate myself every day for it." I felt a crack inside me. Not enough to forgive, but enough to see the woman I thought I knew was broken too. There was a long pause between us. Then she looked up. "I want to make things right. I want to rebuild whatever is left of us." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her again. But trust doesn't rebuild overnight. It's messy. It's slow. It's painful. I told her I needed time, and I meant it. The days turned into weeks. I focused on something else, something I hoped would give my pain a purpose. With the money restored to me, I decided to honor Mom in a way that mattered. I set up a scholarship fund in her name, a fund to help local students, especially those in healthcare, because that's what Mom believed in, caring for others, investing in the future. Each application I read, every thank you letter I received, felt like a small piece of healing. Like Mom's kindness was still alive in the world through these young people chasing their dreams. And through the scholarship, I found my own strength. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One late autumn afternoon, just as the first snowflakes began to fall, I received a call that stopped me cold. It was Natalie, her voice shaky, desperate. "Sarah, I need help." I hesitated. "Help with what?" She swallowed the words like poison. "My husband, he's disappeared. The business, it's worse than I thought. There are debts. People are angry. I don't know what to do." I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, frustration, anger, but also a flicker of compassion. For all her mistakes, she was in trouble, and maybe this was the moment everything would break or finally begin to mend. I told her I'd come over. When I arrived, the house was dark except for a single light in the kitchen. She opened the door, her eyes red and swollen from crying. There was no pretense now, no excuses. Just two broken sisters standing on the edge of something unknown. She handed me a stack of papers, bills, foreclosure notices, legal threats. "This is our mess now," she said, voice trembling. And I realized that the fight wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about family, about responsibility, about forgiveness. I sat with her for hours that night. We talked about everything: the past, the betrayals, the pain, and for the first time in a long time, I saw hope. Hope that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. But hope is fragile, and sometimes it takes one more unexpected storm to either break you completely or make you stronger than ever before. Because what happened next, no one saw coming, and it would change everything between us forever. But that's a story for another time. For now, all I know is this: families aren't perfect. We break, we hurt, we lose, but sometimes, if we're lucky, we find our way back. The nights grew colder, and so did the weight on my chest. Sitting beside Natalie in that dim kitchen, poring over bills and foreclosure notices, I felt something strange, something fragile yet profound. Like the fragile threads of a bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank. I could see it in her eyes, the fear, the shame, but also a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years. Desperation, but also determination. The husband who vanished. His name was Mark. He had been the silent storm behind everything. The failing business, the debts, the panic that pushed Natalie to sell our mother's house. I knew little about him, really. Just the stories Natalie told, the late nights, the meetings, the promises that turned into broken dreams. And now Mark was gone. No calls, no messages, just silence. The first few days after that night in the kitchen were a blur. I juggled hospital shifts and late nights, making calls to creditors and lawyers, trying to piece together what Mark had left behind. Natalie barely left the house. I caught her one afternoon sitting in Mom's old rocking chair, staring at nothing, tears streaming silently down her face. She was drowning in guilt, and I couldn't help but wonder, was this punishment enough? But then something unexpected happened. Natalie started to fight. Not for herself, for us. She started calling old clients, asking for extensions. She worked odd jobs to chip away at the mounting debt. She even agreed to counseling to confront the roots of her choices and the damage she'd done. It was a side of her I never thought I'd see. A sister willing to face the wreckage and try to rebuild. But while Natalie's journey to redemption was underway, mine took a different turn. Running the scholarship fund meant countless meetings, reading applications, and meeting young people whose stories lit up the darkest corners of my heart. Kids who reminded me of Mom, kind, compassionate, resilient. One evening, I met Emily. She was a young woman from a small town struggling to stay in school while caring for her sick grandmother. Her eyes sparkled with hope despite the hardship. She reminded me why Mom's legacy mattered, why I had to keep going. One night, as I was finishing paperwork for the fund, my phone buzzed. A message from Natalie. "Sarah, can we talk? Please, it's urgent." I felt a knot in my stomach. We met at the same cafe where our fragile conversation had begun. She looked worn but resolute. I found something she said, sliding a thin envelope across the table. Inside were letters and documents, proof of Mark's financial deception, forged contracts, and illegal loans. "She's been running scams behind his back," Natalie whispered, voice trembling. Suddenly, the picture shifted. The man who vanished was not just a failing businessman. He was a criminal, a fraudster. And now the weight of his sins was dragging Natalie and me deeper into chaos. We decided to go to the police, to expose the truth. But exposing the truth doesn't mean the truth will set you free. Instead, it means opening wounds you thought were closed. Weeks passed. The investigation unfolded. The media caught wind of the story. Our family's name splashed across headlines torn between sympathy and scandal. At work, whispers followed me down hospital corridors. Some patients asked if it was true, if I could still care for others while my own life was unraveling. And through it all, I held on to the memory of Mom, to the hope of healing, to the belief that even shattered families could find a way to be whole again. But the hardest test was yet to come. One cold morning, as spring teased its arrival, I received a call from Mark. He was back, alive, and he wanted to talk. My heart pounded. Fear, anger, confusion, all tangled together. What did he want? Why now could we forgive the unforgivable? That call opened a door I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. But sometimes life forces you to confront the darkest shadows to find the light. And as I sat on my porch phone, trembling in hand, I realized this was not just a story about a house, a betrayal, or even a family. It was about who we are when everything falls apart, and how sometimes the strongest thing we can do is hold on to hope, to love, to each other. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection. It's about fighting through the broken pieces and finding a way back home. And that journey, that story, is far from over. The moment Mark's voice echoed through the phone, a storm of emotions crashed inside me. Anger, disbelief, and beneath it all, a raw, aching curiosity. Why now? After all this time? I hesitated, my fingers gripping the phone tighter than I realized. "Why are you calling?" I managed to say, voice trembling. His reply was almost a whisper. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I need to explain. Please, just hear me out." That night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every betrayal, every tear shed. Could I find it in myself to listen, to understand? The next afternoon, we met in a quiet park near downtown Boise. The air was crisp, and the early spring sun filtered softly through budding branches. Mark looked older, more worn than the last time I'd seen him. His eyes held a haunted pain, a man crushed beneath the weight of his own mistakes. "I never wanted any of this," he began, voice rough. "The business, the debts, the lies, it all spun out of control. I made terrible choices. I thought I could fix it, but it only got worse." I searched his face for any sign of remorse. "I didn't mean to hurt Natalie or you. I just lost control." I swallowed hard, the bitterness rising in my throat. "How do you explain the forged documents, the scams, the people you swindled?" His hands trembled. I was desperate. I got in too deep. "I'm not proud of it, but I want to make amends." The words felt fragile, like a thread stretched thin over a chasm. Could I believe him? Could I forgive? I wanted to, but forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a journey. One step forward, 2 steps back. Mark's return shattered the fragile calm we'd built. Natalie oscillated between hope and despair. She wanted to believe he could change. I wanted to protect her from more pain. But life, unpredictable and relentless, doesn't wait for us to be ready. One evening, as I was locking up the house, my phone rang. It was Emily, the scholarship recipient. Her voice was trembling, urgent. "Sarah, something's wrong. I don't know who else to call." I raced to her apartment, heart pounding. When I arrived, the scene was chaos. Emily's grandmother was unconscious, struggling to breathe. I called 911 and began CPR, my hands steady despite the fear. Minutes stretched like hours. The paramedics arrived, took over, and rushed them to the hospital. I followed closely, praying silently. Later that night, as Emily sat beside her grandmother's bed, tears streaming, she looked at me with a fragile smile. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. In that moment, I felt the weight of all my battles, the family drama, the financial ruin shrink into insignificance compared to this raw human connection. The next weeks blurred into a whirlwind of hospital visits, court hearings, and endless phone calls. Mark's legal troubles deepened. The police uncovered more fraud. Natalie stood by him, but I saw the toll it took on her soul. I, too, was unraveling. Sleep became elusive. Stress gnawed at my nerves. One night, after a long shift at the hospital, I collapsed on the couch, overwhelmed. The silence was deafening. Memories of Mom flooded back her strength, her compassion, her unwavering love. It was her legacy that kept me grounded. I clung to it like a lifeline. But even legacies can feel fragile when the present is so broken. In the midst of chaos, a small light flickered. The scholarship fund's first recipient, a young man named David, called me. I got accepted to nursing school, he said, voice full of hope. His success felt like a balm to my wounded heart. Proof that even in darkness, life can bloom. Still, the family fracture loomed. Natalie's efforts to repair our bond were sincere but tentative. We met less frequently. Each encounter was a delicate dance. Careful words, cautious glances, the unspoken history between us. One rainy afternoon, she invited me to the house Mom left behind. "It's empty now," she said softly, "but it's where everything started, and maybe where it can begin again." Walking through the rooms, I felt the ghosts of our past. Laughter, arguments, tears all woven into the fabric of those walls. It struck me how much we'd lost, and how much we still had to fight for. Natalie and I sat in the living room, the silence heavy, but not hostile. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I want to be better, for Mom, for us." I reached out, hesitating, then took her hand. The warmth surprised me. Maybe this was the fragile start of something new. But just as the possibility of healing shimmered life through another wrench. Mark's arrest made headlines. The scandal engulfed us. Relatives took sides. Friends whispered. The community that once looked up to Mom's family now saw us as a cautionary tale. I felt myself shrinking under the weight of judgment and pain. Yet amidst the chaos, a small voice inside urged me to keep going, to hold on to hope, because the story wasn't finished. It never would be. And maybe, just maybe, from these shattered pieces, something stronger could rise. But that future, that hope, would demand everything we had and more. And as I looked out the rain-streaked window that evening, I knew this was just the beginning of the hardest chapter yet. The arrest of Mark was a shockwave that reverberated through every corner of my life. I remember the day the news broke, standing in the hospital break room, the fluorescent lights harsh overhead, the whisper of conversations fading into a heavy silence as someone showed me the headline on their phone. The man who had haunted our family's darkest nightmares was now behind bars, facing charges that seemed almost too monstrous to believe. It felt surreal. And yet, as I stared at the screen, a hollow ache settled deep in my chest. The public scrutiny was suffocating. Whispers followed me down every hallway, every aisle of the grocery store. The very air seemed thick with judgment. Friends became distant colleagues, exchanged awkward glances. Even patients, those vulnerable souls I dedicated my life to caring for, asked quietly if I was okay, if the family scandal had touched me too deeply. And in the midst of it all, Natalie was crumbling. She wasn't just my sister anymore. She was a woman fighting to survive the wreckage of a life she helped break. One afternoon, she called me, voice barely audible. "I don't know how to fix this, Sarah," she said, tears breaking free. "I'm so sorry for everything." Her confession cracked something open inside me, because for all the betrayal, all the pain, she was still my sister, and I loved her. That night, I found myself pacing in my living room, the silence deafening. I thought about Mom, about the strength she showed when times were hard, about the love she poured into our family, even when we were falling apart. I realized then that maybe, just maybe, this was our chance to honor her memory, not by dwelling on the past, but by fighting for a better future. Natalie and I began meeting more often, slowly, tentatively, no grand gestures, just small moments, sharing a cup of coffee, laughing at an old joke, sitting together in silence. It was messy, imperfect, but real. And in those moments, I saw glimpses of the sister I once knew, the one who loved fiercely despite her mistakes. But life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. One evening, after a long shift, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Mark's. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a note short but heavy with meaning. Sarah, I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I'm trying to change. Please don't give up on us. Tears blurred my vision. Could a man who had brought so much destruction truly seek redemption? Could I forgive him? Could I let go of the bitterness? I wasn't sure. But one thing was clear. The road ahead was long and full of challenges none of us were prepared for. Meanwhile, the scholarship fund began to flourish. Each letter I received from students touched my heart. Stories of struggle, resilience, and hope, like Emily, who had recovered and was thriving in nursing school, like David, who was now volunteering at the local clinic. Their journeys reminded me why Mom's legacy mattered, why I had to keep fighting not just for my family, but for the future. Yet the family wounds still ran deep. Relatives remained divided. Some blamed Natalie, others pitied her. Few understood the complexity of our pain, and sometimes, late at night, I wondered if the fractures would ever truly heal. One rainy afternoon, Natalie and I sat in Mom's old kitchen. The rain tapped softly against the window. We spoke quietly about the past, about mistakes, about forgiveness. I want to be better, she said, voice steady but vulnerable. For you, for Mom, for myself. I reached out, squeezing her hand. We'll figure it out, I promised, because despite everything, despite the scars and the heartache, I believed in us, in family, in hope. But even as we took tentative steps forward, shadows lingered. Mark's trial loomed, the media circus intensified, and the pressure threatened to break us all. One night as I sat alone, I realized this story, our story, was far from over. It was just beginning. And whatever came next, we would face it together, because that's what family does. We break, we hurt, we fall. But we keep going, we keep fighting, we keep loving, and sometimes in the darkest moments, that's enough. The weight of Mark's arrest lingered like a thick fog, settling over every facet of my life. The headlines in the local papers, the whispers in grocery store aisles, even the cautious glances from patients at the hospital, they all reminded me that our family's turmoil was no longer private. It was laid bare for the world to see. Every whispered accusation, every pointed finger cut deeper than I expected. But inside me, beneath the exhaustion and pain, a stubborn ember of resolve burned bright. This wasn't just about me or Natalie anymore. It was about the legacy of our mother, about the values she stood for: strength, love, and unyielding hope in the face of adversity. I had to find a way to hold on to that, no matter how fractured everything seemed. Natalie reached out more and more often, her voice softer, laced with regret and a fragile hope. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said one afternoon, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to make this right. For you, for Mom, for us." It was a small bridge between us, but it felt like the first step out of a long, dark tunnel. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that beneath the mistakes, beneath the betrayals, there was still the sister I once knew. But trust, once broken, isn't rebuilt overnight. It's a slow, painstaking process, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And yet, despite my fears, I found myself reaching out to her, too desperate for connection, for healing. The scholarship fund we started in Mom's name became a lifeline for me. Letters from students filled my mailbox, stories of struggle, of dreams rekindled, of futures transformed. Emily, the young woman who had nearly lost her grandmother, was thriving now in nursing school. David, another scholarship recipient, was volunteering at the community clinic. Each story was a balm to my weary heart, a reminder that from pain, hope can still grow. Yet even as I found small pockets of peace, the shadows of the past clung tight. The family remained fractured. Relatives took sides, old resentments flared. At family gatherings, conversations were guarded, filled with tension and unspoken blame. The house Mom once cherished felt hollow, haunted by memories, both beautiful and painful. One rainy afternoon, Natalie invited me over. The house was quiet, except for the soft patter of rain on the roof. We sat in the kitchen, the same room where Mom used to cook and laugh, where we had fought and loved in equal measure. The silence stretched heavy with everything left unsaid. "I don't know if we can fix this," Natalie whispered, eyes downcast. "But I want to try, for Mom and for us." I reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "Me too," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside me. Those moments of tentative reconciliation gave me hope, but the storm outside our fragile truce was far from over. Mark's trial was approaching, and with it a media frenzy that threatened to tear the last threads of our family apart. The courtroom became a battleground not just for justice, but for the very soul of what was left of our family. Mark appeared before the judge with a face etched in lines of regret and defiance. His eyes met mine briefly, and in that moment, I saw a man who had been crushed under the weight of his own choices. It was a painful sight. A man I once loved, now a stranger, shaped by his mistakes. The prosecution laid bare every detail of his deception, the forged signatures, the stolen inheritance, the lies that had shattered lives. I sat in the courtroom, heart pounding, as the evidence unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I thought of Mom's sacrifices, the years I'd spent caring for her, the trust we all placed in each other. Natalie sat beside me, trembling but determined. Despite everything she stood by, Mark caught between loyalty and heartbreak. Watching her, I realized how complex love could be, how it could bind people even when broken. After long, grueling days, the trial pressed on each session, peeling back more layers of pain. But through the darkness, a strange strength emerged within me. I realized that this battle was bigger than retribution. It was about reclaiming our dignity, about building a future from the rubble of the past. One evening, exhausted, yet unable to sleep, I sat alone in my living room. The weight of everything pressed down on me, but beneath it all, a flicker of determination burned bright. I thought of Mom's voice, steady and comforting, urging me to keep faith, to be strong. I knew then that whatever happened in that courtroom, whatever the verdict, my fight wasn't just for justice. It was for healing, for family, for hope. And as the trial continued, I felt the fragile threads of our story weaving into something new, a story not just of loss, but of resilience, because even in the deepest darkness, light can find a way to shine through. If you want to follow this journey to see what comes next for our family, don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more ahead, and I promise the story is far from over.